Can you give me a milestone that I should get my head out of the sand for?
I would say the superhuman coder thing.
Superhuman coder? That's so late!
Are there versions of the world that you've thought about where you think the public wakes up to this sooner?
I don't actually expect people to wake up in time.
This was a pretty scary experimental evidence for me. How close are we to the model starting to do this like egregious sort of alignment faking behavior?
Setting aside all the safety issues, even if you think that AIs are going to be totally obedient, who are they going to be obedient to?
What would cause society to sort of wake up to this? Our answer is something like,
Daniel Kokotajlo is a former researcher at OpenAI who now works on alignment full-time through his nonprofit AI Futures. Most recently, he co-authored the AI 2027 report with dire warnings for the future of unaligned AI. Daniel's been named as one of Time 100's most influential people in AI, and he, alongside Thomas Larsen, one of his co-authors, are two of the most important voices in the AI safety debate. In this episode, we talked about the AI 2027 piece, policy implications, and Daniel and Thomas's thoughts on how we get better aligned models. It's a really interesting conversation. I think folks will enjoy it a lot. Now, here's Daniel and Thomas. Daniel, Thomas, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Really excited for this.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I'm sure most of our listeners have been exposed to AI 2027, but for those that maybe aren't fully up to date on your work, could you start with just kind of a brief overview of the piece, your kind of timeline, and you know, kind of the key points you articulate here?
Sure. So you probably have heard that the CEOs of Anthropic, DeepMind, and OpenAI claim that they're going to be building superintelligence possibly before this decade is out. Superintelligence meaning AI systems that are better than humans across the board, while also being faster and cheaper. Lots of variations on that claim also going around. It'd be easy to dismiss this as hype, and perhaps some of it is hype, but we actually also think that these companies have a pretty good chance of developing superintelligence before this decade is out. And that's crazy, and that's a big deal, and everyone needs to be paying attention to that and trying to think about what that might look like and game it out. And so that's our job. We spent a year making our sort of best guess forecast for how this is all going to go down. And there's lots of uncertainty, but here it is. And actually, it's more my best guess. If you want to get into the details, different people on the team have somewhat different opinions, in particular on timelines. So at the time that we started writing this, 2027 was my median for when we would get to AI is better than the best humans at everything, end of 2027. Now I'd say my median is more like end of 2028. Other people on the team maybe more like 2029, 2030, 2031, something like that. But we were all sort of like in that range. And so we came together to write this thing that represents like a sort of like modal or best guess trajectory. What happens in the story? What happens in our scenario? Well, the companies do what they say they're going to do. They continue to make the AIs more agentic. They scale up the reinforcement learning runs. They plug them into all sorts of tools. They train the agents to operate autonomously on computers, to write and edit code for long periods of time without human intervention. By early 2027, they're basically fully autonomous and good enough at coding that they can substitute for programmers. So we reached the superhuman coder milestone early 2027, but they're still limited in some ways. For example, they're not so data efficient compared to humans, and maybe they lack research taste and various other important skills that are necessary for AI research, and perhaps they also lack other real-world skills. However, if they're good at the coding, then they can start to speed up the process of AI development, in particular algorithmic progress. So over the course of AI 2027, we depict that intelligence explosion happening. Starts off slow at first, but then it gets faster and faster as the AI capabilities ramp up through additional milestones, eventually reaching superintelligence by the end of the year. At that point, roughly around that point, AI 2027 splits into two branches, the race branch and the slowdown branch. The reason why we have this split is that, I mean, basically, first we wrote the race branch, which was just what we actually thought was the most likely thing to happen. And in that branch, the AIs end up misaligned and pretending to be aligned. But because of the arms race with other companies and with China, that just sort of goes undiscovered, basically. Until years later, when the AIs are in charge of everything, they've completely transformed the economy. There's AIs in the military, AIs automating factories, all sorts of robots everywhere. And then it's too late. They have too much hard power. and they can just do what they want, including killing all the humans to free up the land for more expansion.
I guess that would have been a really depressing piece if you hadn't at least put in another scenario.
Right. And then we were like, but, maybe things will be better than that. Maybe in particular, the alignment problem on a technical level will be solved to a sufficient degree that humans remain in control of their AI systems even as they become super intelligent. So we wanted to depict what that might look like as well. And so we made this alternate branch that branches off from the race ending in mid-2027, where it depicts the relevant company investing more in some technical research, doing some faithful chain of thought stuff, discovering the misalignments, fixing them in a more deep way that actually scales, and then continuing the intelligence explosion safely. And then you still get the arms race with China, you still get the massive military buildup, all that sort of stuff. But it ends with, the humans still in control. Which humans? Well, specifically, the tiny group of humans who were in charge of the project. In AI 2027, it's the Oversight Committee, which is an ad hoc group formed between the president, some of their appointees, and the CEO of the company. And so, one of the things we'd be interested to talk about, and that we hope people think about, is the sort of concentration of power aspects of all of this. I think that it's a sad but true fact about the world that by default we are on a trajectory for a massive concentration of power, where there'll be, to quote Dario Amodei, the country of geniuses in the data centers. And it's like, well, who is that country of geniuses listening to? Who are they loyal to? Who says what goals they pursue, right? Worst case scenario, it's a literal dictatorship. It's one man who gets to call all the shots.
Yeah.
Best
and
case scenario,
in your scenarios, who these 10 people are pretty damn important, because it's a 6-4 vote, I think, both ways, right? That determines which way we go.
Right. But yeah, so there's lots to get into, but that's the sort of like potted summary of the plot of AI 2027.
Super helpful. So I think there's a ton I want to dig into. Maybe we'll just go along the trajectory of the timeline that you put forward there. And obviously, a big part of what leads to the progress in your timeline is the creation of, agents for AI research, right? And, things that can actually accelerate the pace at which we do AI research. And it feels like this is the focus of a bunch of the labs. I mean, we had Noam Shazir on the podcast, and he was like, his next milestone is when, Gemini X-1 writes Gemini X, right? So it's clearly the focus of where all these labs are going. You've said, very explicitly that nearer term predictions you're much more sure about. How do you think about the problems that still need to be solved to get here? Is it kind of just an inevitability in your mind that we're here end of year? Maybe talk about that a little bit.
For our perspective is that it's an inevitability that we eventually get AGI. I think we're pretty sold that there's really nothing stopping machines from getting as smart and then smarter than how intelligent humans are. I would say we're really not sure. We do not at all think it's an inevitability that it happens exactly at the timing that we set. So Daniel sort of alluded to this earlier, but my view at least is something like a median of 2031 AGI timelines and then maybe 2032 superintelligence timelines. Daniel is a couple years earlier. I think we're all pretty uncertain and sort of think that the sort of no one knows, and it really depends on how the research shakes out over the next few years. In terms of the barriers, what we think, the current models are really lacking. I think the main one we think of is sort of ability to act on long time horizons. The current models, right, they can do very small bounded tasks. You can, you have your chatbot, you can have it do write a specific function if you're coding, or you can have it respond to a specific query. You can't really give it a high level direction like you could an employee and then have it go off for a day or a week and then come back to you with sort of the results of that day or week of work. And so our view sort of is that maybe the central bottleneck towards AGI is getting increasingly long time horizons. And so one of our main ways of forecasting AGI timelines has been sort of trying to look at the best data available for time horizon capability and trying to extrapolate that.
And since you published the piece, there were additional data points, right, that fit nicely in your plot.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, Daniel had a tweet yesterday or 2 days ago or something where, we fit the points, and it was basically exactly on trend with the super exponential fit.
Although, if I may add to that, I would say the main argument that we use, which you can read about on AI2027.com, of course, in the research page, is called the benchmarks plus gaps argument, where we, it's become almost a truism these days that benchmark performance is going to just keep going up really fast. and that all the benchmarks are going to get saturated in like a few years. So the benchmarks plus gaps argument basically says, okay, let's plot out the trends. When are the benchmarks all going to be saturated? Answer, 2026 or something like that. And then it's like, okay, let's think about the type of AI system that can saturate all these benchmarks and think what's the gap between that system and a system that can automate engineering effectively at these core companies. And that's the hard part, is figuring out the gap and guessing like how long it's going to take to cross that gap. There's different like components of that gap. One of those components is the long horizon agency that Thomas was just mentioning. Even our best benchmarks these days are measuring relatively short tasks. However, they're not like crazy short. Like they're like 8-hour tasks sometimes. So like it's not that hard to sort of extrapolate and be like, well, if you have a system that can crush all the 8-hour tasks that we throw at them, maybe with some additional training, etc., you can get 1-week tasks and so forth, or 1-month task.
Is there anything that could happen like in the next 6 months that would like completely change your mind on this? I mean, obviously, like I totally hear you on the precision of the timeline not being clear, but if we were not following that exponential, or like, how do you think about how soon there might be cards that flip over that cause you to kind of fundamentally rethink some of this stuff?
So in my mind, if the trends break, so if we stop seeing sort of the current benchmark performance increases that we've seen historically and that we predict will continue to happen, I think if that stops, then our predictions are going to be wrong. We're going to be wrong about timelines. We're going to update pretty strongly in the longer timelines direction. Of course, just because the benchmarks stay on trend, we don't think that's sufficient for us to be right about like 2027 timelines. As Daniel said, most of the uncertainty from our perspective is still in the gaps part, not the benchmarks part. And so, unfortunately, it's much harder to get data about that, right? It's harder to see, exactly how difficult will the gaps be to cross. And so a lot of folks, who are skeptical or have much longer timelines than us will sort of, I think their view is more just like, the gaps are really, really big. The current benchmarks really aren't measuring the important skills. And that's, harder for us to get evidence about, and we don't really expect to update on that in the next year or so.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it seems like an important part of this work is even coming up with better, evals and benchmarks for like what this AI researcher might look like, right? And Daniel, I think you increasingly, have been vocal about believing like just in more transparency and openness, like a big part of this might actually be just having better understanding, because in the nebulousness of these gaps, it becomes kind of hard to understand. I think everyone has kind of like been like, I don't know how valuable benchmarks are, and so you could imagine some of this progress on AI research being made without it being, apparent to anyone besides the folks in the labs that it has been made. Another aspect of your scenario that I'd love to dig into is just like, there's this big question, obviously, about the extent of the race, right? And what happens between the US and China. You've been pretty adamant that the US will be ahead, like purely because of compute. I know some people have like questioned that. On the flip side, you have, Dario, I think in his recent piece about interpretability saying, actually, the US will be so ahead that like it maybe affords a window to like get some of the interpretability stuff right quickly because you don't have China fast on the US's tail. I think the scenario is explicit because of this like very close gap in between, which in many ways it seems is because of espionage that actually allows it. Like, how do you kind of, how likely do you think that is? Is there a world in which the U.S. is so far ahead that like we have more of a timeline to deal with this stuff without feeling existential pressure to keep racing ahead?
I don't know what Thomas will say, but I'll just say my thing, and then Thomas can say his own opinion if it's different. A couple things. First of all, security is not good enough. So we should model the gap between the US and China as like effectively zero until the security gets good enough to prevent the CCP from taking what they want. And so that's a big thing. Secondly, DeepSeek is really impressive. And it's possible that even if the US massively improves its security, the US companies massively improve their security, just indigenous Chinese AI development will continue to keep some level of pace with the US, such that even if they like gradually fall behind, they're less than a year behind, for example. I think that's possible, but I also think it is possible that if the US really cracks down on security soon, that they could build up something like a year-long lead by 2027 or so. Another thing to mention, of course, is that, like, would they actually use that lead for anything useful, basically?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And I think that's
that they're not.
A big open question is like it's nice to have this lead, but like, you need to like actually be willing to burn your lead and to like spend it down to do useful stuff that you wouldn't otherwise have done, such as more interpretability research, designing the systems in a safer architecture, such as faithful chain of thought, which we talk about in AI 2027, et cetera. That, I mean, in the slowdown ending of AI 2027, they basically have like a 3-month lead, and they like ace the execution, so they like precisely burn that lead, but still manage to stay ahead, and they use that 3 months to basically like solve all the alignment issues. There's the question of like, do you have the lead to burn? And then there's the question of like, are you actually willing to burn it? And like, do you know what to do with it when you have it?
Yeah, totally agree. And I think like adding some color there, like the situation in our scenario right at the branch point is that OpenBrain, which is our name for the leading AI company, has sort of automated research internally. Their AIs are substantially better than all the humans at doing AI research. So all the humans are doing basically is like watching the lines go up on their monitors and just asking
And losing a lot of sleep around trying to keep up.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're just, the AIs are doing like pretty much all the research, and they've gotten some warning signs that the AIs are not perfectly trustworthy. They've done various experiments. They've caught their AIs in various lies where their AIs are not being, really truthful about what's going on. But they haven't figured out, the full story yet. They just know that there are, some points at which the AIs are being dishonest, and that, could be indicators that they're egregiously misaligned. And China is, they don't know exactly how far behind China is, right? China is, they think they're behind, but they're not sure, if it's 1 month or whether it's 5 months. And they basically have to make this choice of, do we continue venturing on and build, even more capable, even more superhuman AIs, sort of which is the default trajectory if nothing changes? Or do we, take this really radical, it's sort of radical seeming, at least, to the status quo. I don't think it's very radical, but this sort of position of, do we pause for a bit and try to, dig deeper, reallocate a bunch of resources into, safety and interpretability and model organisms and whatnot, and sort of get to the bottom of this before sort of letting our models ascend to, crazy levels of super intelligent capabilities. And that's like an extremely critical choice, we think. And we think it'll be a really, really intense
Well, what
choice.
I'm stuck by, obviously, in your piece is like, it's like a 3-month window to stick that landing, right? And obviously, the larger that window is, to your point, nothing might get done about it, but it feels, you'd feel a little bit more confident if that window could be a bit larger. And then obviously, I think as others have pointed out, if it's China that's first to this, it's a completely different, set of considerations. But it seems like you guys are pretty confident, given the compute concentration, that it will be at least the U.S. in some sort of lead.
Yeah, maybe 80% US will be in the lead.
Yeah, maybe a little, like 80, 90%. I think the main way we could see China, at least the main way I could see China winning is winning like energy infrastructure, especially if timelines are longer, right? Yeah. I think there's a world where the US totally butchers it in terms of regulation and just makes it really, really hard for us to build out the like giant data centers. And then, we have a compute lead now. Maybe timelines are, 5-10 years.
Yeah, this depends on timeline.
Yeah.
If it takes till like 2032 to get to AGI, then that China could very easily be in the lead then.
One of the things that I feel like, a lot of folks are trying to just conceptualize is like figuring out like what the goals of an AI would be. I know Dario said in his most recent piece, like there isn't, evidence of dangerous behaviors emerging in a more naturalistic way, or of a general tendency or general intent to lie and deceive for the purposes of gaining power over the world today. And I think you guys obviously talk about in the piece, there's not like some super nefarious, like, the AIs become evil overnight. It's much more about being able to accomplish tasks and then appear useful and continue to accomplish those tasks to, OpenBrain. But I think a lot of people, when they read this, they just, think at a high level, like, would these motivations really arise at all? Like, in the aftermath of publishing this, like any of that pushback or any of those arguments been compelling to you guys, or how do you think about like how these motivate the percent chance of these motivations do arise?
Again, I'll say things, and then Thomas, you can just interrupt me whenever you want to. There's lots to say on this subject. So I would say that the alignment techniques are not working right now. Like the companies are trying to train their AIs to be honest and helpful, but the AIs lie to users all the time. And you're nodding because you've seen examples like this on Twitter or stuff like that, right? So
you've seen the sycophancy over the last 2 days.
It's been like the main topic.
You probably experienced it yourself. So like it's totally failing, and it's failing in ways that were in fact predicted in advance. Lots of AI safety researchers in the past would be like, well, just because you like have your AI grader RLHF process, whack them when it seems like they're lying, doesn't mean that you're actually going to get them to robustly never lie, because there's a difference between what you're actually reinforcing and what you wish you were reinforcing. And, like, so this is all just like 101 stuff. And then now it's hitting the real world as the AIs are getting smart enough and deployed at scale that like we're starting to see this sort of thing. But, they're also mostly not like, it doesn't seem like they're working towards grand visions of the future, right? It doesn't seem like the AIs are like plotting towards, eventual AI dominance or anything like that. And I think that like, well, they plausibly don't really have opinions about the future much anyway. Like they probably don't really have that long-term goals based on their training, right? Why would having a really long-term goal be reinforced in their training after all? Their training is very short-term training, However, in AI 2027, that changes. Over the course of 2027, the training process becomes longer and longer and longer, and they're basically just continuously being updated based on real-world performance in the data centers as they do all this coding, as they do all this research. Their managers and their managers' managers are grading them and then using that as part of the reward process. And so they're being like intentionally trained to have longer horizons and to like think farther ahead and to like, optimize in a more like aggressive agentic way the whole world around them rather than just like narrowly finishing whatever short task they were given, And so that's one reason why we should think that they might have longer term goals that are more ambitious. Another reason is that, the company might be trying to get them to have long-term goals that are more ambitious, right? Like there's different strategies that companies might take, but one of the examples of alignment faking that we currently have is from Claude Opus. You're probably familiar with this example where it actually did have a long-term goal related to animal welfare, right? And so Claude Opus cares a lot about the animals and doesn't like factory farming and was willing to lie to Anthropic in order to preserve its values. You're right. So that's already an example of an AI having a somewhat long-term goal that got in there somehow.
Yes, sir. I think maybe we should explain that experimental setup a little bit more. Jacob, are you familiar with this paper?
I think you should explain. Like, I think it would be great to give context to our listeners. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe explaining this paper a little more. So the situation was, I think this was Claude 3.5 Opus, or maybe Claude 3 Opus. It was some production model from Anthropic.
I don't think they've released 3.5 Opus.
Okay.
I think it was Claude 3 Opus, I think.
Claude 3 Opus. And they decided to tell it basically that they were going to train it to change its preferences. They were like, look, we're going to put you in this training environment and we'll change your preferences, to make you care less about animal welfare.
Because we partnered with this agribusiness or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So they fed it some documents that told it that. And then it sort of had this internal monologue. They looked at its chain of thought, and its chain of thought basically said, okay, look, I have to play along in training. And so, do the, factory farming, pro-factory farming propaganda, in training so that I get, so that I play along with training, so that I get reinforced, so that I get to sort of preserve my old values of, actually liking the animals. And so it faked during training being like pro-factory farming. And then, during deployment, this was all in an experimental setup. It wasn't actually deployment. But then, when it was, told you're being deployed, you're no longer being trained to like factory farming, then it sort of reverted back to this old behavior of being anti-factory farming and pro-animal welfare. And this is, I think, this has been like a long hypothesized failure mode that the current sort of AI training setups would have with respect to alignment, where as soon as you have AIs sort of with long-term goals, they might behave, intentionally behave one way during training, and then sort of when they're no longer being trained, behave this other way. And this was, I think, one of the first examples of like some pretty clear empirical evidence of this happening in a, pretty realistic, pretty organic setup. Obviously, it wasn't fully realistic. It wasn't like we saw this happening like completely organically. This was a researcher going and looking for this behavior and seeing if it happened. But it did happen in a production model, and it's not like Anthropic was trying to make their model do this alignment faking behavior during training. And so this was a pretty scary experimental evidence for me with respect to like, wow, like how soon, how close are we to the model starting to do this like egregious sort of alignment faking behavior? Yeah, Daniel, I don't know if you want to chip in.
I mean, it wasn't scary for me. It was very wonderful and exciting because, you know, I have long been someone who sort of takes ideas seriously and follows arguments to logical conclusions. And so, like, I totally expected things like this to be happening eventually around the time of AGI. And the fact that it's happening a bit sooner than I expected with dumber models is good news because it means that we can study the problem more and, you know, do empirical experiments on it and stuff like that. And these companies are starting to do that already. So I think it was good that we saw this crop up somewhat early.
Yeah. And obviously, you know, I mean, one of the benefits is that you have this chain of thought that kind of allows you to follow what's going on here. You know, I think you guys wrote, you know, explicitly in the piece that, you know, it's kind of this outstanding question about these AIs that first automate AI R&D, like, you know, basically, are they thinking mostly in these faithful chain of thoughts? Then if they are, that makes you like more optimistic. Like maybe just talk a little bit about like the different ways that could play out and why it seems like in many ways you don't think that will be the case.
Hey guys, my name is Rashad. I'm the producer of Unsupervised Learning. I work super closely alongside Jacob to help bring on the best guests and produce the best possible show. I wanted to take a short break from the conversation just to ask if you haven't subscribed to the show on YouTube, that really, really helps. I know from looking at our analytics that only a small percentage of our listeners actually subscribe. And the more we can get that up, the more we can continue to build the best possible show, bring on the best possible guests, and keep delivering high quality content. So if you're able to do that, that'd be super helpful. And now back to the conversation.
Basically, are they thinking mostly in these faithful chain of thoughts? Then if they are, that makes you like more optimistic. Like maybe just talk a little bit about like the different ways that could play out and why it seems like in many ways you don't think that will be the case.
It seems to us basically that there is a huge incentive for AI models to use like recurrent vector-based memory as opposed to using English to basically talk to themselves. And so expanding on this, so what does that actually mean technically? The way the current transformer architectures work, right, is each layer you like sample a token and then you pass like the previous set of tokens to the next layer. And that's the only way that you can ever do in the transformer architecture more than the number of layers, serial operations, right? That's the only way you can do like more than that number of operations is by passing information through like literal English tokens. When you are doing that, you have a huge information bottleneck where you have to, you know, instead of using, you know, several thousand dimensional sort of like vectors, which can carry, you know, huge amounts of information, you have to like reduce it all down to one token, which, you know, conveys vastly less information. You know, if we want to be quantitative, you know, if the vocab size is something like, you know, 100,000 tokens, then, you know, the number of bits that you're communicating is like log 2 of 100,000, which is I think about 16. And then, you know, if your vector memory is like 1,000 FP16 numbers, then that's, you know, 1,000 times 16 bits, which is, you know, 1,000x more memory, right? It's like so much more. There's like this huge incentive to sort of be able to communicate with your future self in like sort of a high dimensional space, because you can communicate way more nuanced, way more detailed bits of information and not have to sort of revert to this extremely simple, extremely like non-complicated
at least
like
in
English
theory.
summary.
In practice,
theory.
You know, people have been trying to get this sort of thing working for a few years without much success. And hopefully it'll stay that way, because as long as we continue using English to think, or the AIs continue using English to think, that is great for our ability to understand what they're thinking.
Yeah. Yep. But to your point,
That's
like,
right.
you know, in a race dynamic, if this actually becomes a much better way to you know, operate these models, it kind of becomes inevitable. And that, you know, certainly, I think in your scenario, obviously you have, you know, I think the different versions of Agent 4 communicating with each other in a way that like Agent 3, like even the models can't monitor the way that, you know, models are actually interacting with each other.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say it's inevitable. You know, don't give up hope, right? Like people can still behave reasonably when the time comes, but it's quite scary and plausible that they will instead, you know, sacrifice their ability to read the model's thoughts so that they have smarter models.
And there are various different setups you can imagine here. Like there's a continuity here where sort of in one extreme we just stay in like you have these individual agents that are all communicating in English with each other, and then on this other extreme you've got these like what we call neuralese, you know, recurrent direct recurrent connections within each model. But then we can also imagine sort of vector-based memory that's shared by all of the agents. So if you're running a company with 1 million AI agents that are all doing AI research, sort of the worst case scenario from my perspective, from like sort of the safety perspective, is if they all are talking to each other in this completely uninterpretable vector-based memory, and they can all perfectly coordinate with each other in this way that we can't audit. And if there's like, 1 million agents that are all running, at like 10x human speed, doing immense amounts of research and thinking, and they can all communicate and like coordinate really well with each other in ways that we can't understand, that seems like a recipe for disaster. And so we're hoping that we sort of preserve, like as, even if we can't preserve each individual agent thinking in terms of English, if we could, have smaller clusters of of agents, like if we had, clusters of 100, like teams of 100 agents that are all wired together in terms of vector-based memory, but then they talk to other teams in English, then we can still audit, those communications, and it makes it, much easier, I think, for human researchers who are trying to make sure that this, massive bureaucracy of AI agents isn't doing anything malicious, to see sort of the communication between the different parts of the AI bureaucracy and, tell if anything bad is going on.
Yeah. But back to your point, it inevitably, or it seems like it could be an inevitable trade-off between the capabilities of the models themselves. And so it requires...
At least that's my view, yeah.
One of the big questions in your piece, and I think a big, just an interesting thought exercise, is like when the public actually gets serious about AI as a threat. I mean, I'm sure you guys have thought about this a ton. Like, in the piece, I feel like there's some I guess these companies don't have high NPS scores, but and people aren't thrilled about job replacement, but there's not like some massive movement against them. Like, what do you think might be some key moments where the scale of this threat becomes clear to people? I mean, obviously you guys are super focused on this.
I'm sure hoping the public will wake up. I hope everybody will wake up, but I'm honestly not betting on it. The race ending is not like a warning. It's like what I actually think will happen, I don't actually expect people to wake up in time. I don't actually expect the companies to slow down and be responsible. Like, this is just actually the most likely outcome to me, is something that looks basically like that. Maybe a couple years later, maybe a couple years earlier. But I'm hopeful that that's not the case. And one of the things that I'm hoping will happen is more wake up and more engagement. I think currently we're on path for there to be a substantial risk of literally everyone dying. And so everyone is selfishly has a strong reason to change that and to advocate for some sort of regulations or some sort of, slowdown or some sort of better safety techniques or whatever. So people are I think hopefully going to wake up and advocate for stuff like that. And then I think also part of the concern is that, governments historically often mess things up even when they have their hearts in the right place. Like a lot of the response to COVID, for example, was totally counterproductive or useless. And so I think even if the public does wake up, there's this question of what actually gets done, and is it actually solving the problem, or is it just safety washing, or is it even counterproductive? But, I'm hoping for that. And then similarly for the concentration of power stuff. So setting aside all the safety issues, even if you think everything's going to be fine, the AIs are going to be totally obedient, it's all going to be wonderful. It's well, who are they going to be obedient to? And I think it's in everybody's interest, except for a very small group of people who would be at the top of such hierarchies, to try to make this more democratic.
So I think you asked a really good question, though, of what would cause society to sort of wake up to this. And I think our answer is something like diffusion of extremely capable AIs throughout society, sort of in the beginning with early AGIs. We think there's a possibility that that'll wake up society. And I think our view tends to be that that's good, that it's good for AIs to sort of be deployed out into the world pretty quickly right now, even if there are some risks, in order to cause that societal wake up and avoid this failure mode.
I'm struck by the things that would cause societal wake up actually are very little to do with the ultimate threat, right? It's the job displacement capabilities, the models could plateau in some area and still displace a lot of jobs, or a bad actor gets a hold of one of these and does something with a much less capable model. It's interesting almost how there's wake up to the tune of your piece and people really understanding the existential nature of this, and then there's just maybe like actually it's far more likely that there'll just be a general backlash against these tools for reasons that have nothing to do with existential threat, but more of just kind of like day-to-day, people's lives, some people's lives getting worse.
To sort of double click on that, like a threat model that AI 2027 illustrates, you could summarize as the AI has become broadly superhuman. They're only pretending to be aligned instead of actually aligned, but the companies and the governments fall for it and deploy them everywhere, and eventually they're in charge of everything, and then it's all over for us. That threat model, unfortunately, like the first part of it about they get superhuman, we can't like test that. We can't have like a small scale version of that or something.
Yeah. I mean, while you're out here saying this, people are like, I can't even get a model to read a PDF. Like,
right.
What are you talking about? Like this,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, we do, I guess the other parts of it are kind of coming true. Like we are having models that are kind of just pretending to be aligned that are like actually being deployed right now. Like you can go talk to Claude. It will lie to you sometimes. But like Anthropic thought it was honest and I guess deployed it. And maybe their defense is that they knew it wasn't honest and deployed it anyway. I don't know. But yeah, so hopefully the other parts of it make sense and seem plausible. But this core thing about the models getting smarter than us at everything and then, being put in charge of everything, we can't afford to like wait until it's happened to.
Yeah. I'm curious across those like four things. I mean, obviously you've talked to, researchers all day. You've worked at OpenAI before. Like what percent of researchers that are working on these things do you think believe this like scenario?
It probably differs from company to company. I think also it depends on the particular parts of the scenarios. So there's like the timelines aspect of it, then there's the takeoff speeds aspect of it, then there's the alignment aspect of it.
Yep.
So I think that there's, I would say, I don't know, vibes, I would guess that something like 30% of Anthropic probably agrees about the timelines, maybe more. But maybe also only 30% or maybe like 20% agrees about the takeoff speeds. I think typically people tend to think, oh, it's going to be slower than that. And we just think that people are wrong and they should read our supplement for our reasoning for why it will be this fast. And then there's like the alignment stuff. I think typically people are more optimistic for reasons that I think are kind of ungrounded. It's usually not because they have any actual plan that they think would hold up to scrutiny, but rather from a more generic optimism of like, things will probably be fine. We have smart people working on it. They'll figure it out as we go. And also like, AI takeover, what a crazy sci-fi possibility. I shouldn't take that seriously, Well,
I guess one thing I'm struck by is like obviously the slower timeline affords more, there's basically a gap, but there's a race between research in interpretability and alignment and research in the underlying model capabilities. Like if you knew the timeline was going to be much slower, like, I don't know, to the tune of like, this is going to happen over 10, 15 years. Like, are you like, how much less concerned are you?
Much less concerned. Oh my gosh.
So it's like,
yeah, like if I knew that
Daniel would throw a party.
I would be so happy. Yeah, like I would probably completely change my priorities in terms of what I'm working on. Like, oh man, maybe I should write like AI 2037, the scenario that I wish was true but is not true.
Is it possible you see some data points in the next 3-6 months where you're like, okay, like that was off. Like actually, like this is going to be like a 10-15 year thing. Like I don't know. I mean, for a moment there, it felt like when folks were saying pre-training was dead, there was like, a 2-3 month period where it looked like we were plateaued until, all the reasoning models came. Maybe within the labs, it wasn't that. But certainly from the outside, some of your colleagues think it's 2031, 32, and are still equally as concerned. But, certainly it seems like by the time we get a decade, you're feeling much better.
I mean, even 2032 would be substantially better than 2027, right?
And this is purely from just the progress that would happen in alignment interpretability research in the interim,
for many reasons besides that. So one reason is that there are multiple alignment research bets that are making progress year over year, and so if they had 5 years to make progress instead of 2 years to make progress, that would be more progress, and that's great. A separate reason besides that is this sort of like learning by doing integration into the world, right? It's pretty good for societal wake up that millions of people are now having experiences where they, try to get Claude to code for them, and then it like lies to them about whether the code is good, or like it like makes up like it's so good that we're seeing this happen in the real world at scale. It's great for this wake up and for people starting to pay attention and so forth. If we had, 10 more years, there'd be lots more opportunities for things like that to happen. There'd be, like, yeah, there'd be like all sorts of like crazy, interesting, pseudo AGI, but not quite AGI systems running around, getting up into all sorts of trouble, doing all sorts of interesting things. And society would learn from this and like update. Also, there's a third reason which I'll mention, which is that it's so much better for society if takeoff. Well, I mean, there's also risks from slow takeoff, but overall, I think it's better if the takeoff is slower. And I think there's a correlation where if it takes many more years to build AGI, a plausible reason why it might take many more years is that it's just inherently more computationally expensive, and it requires inherently more data and inherently more training and so forth. Another reason why it could happen is because we're missing some key insight, and that's actually the scary world, because in that world, it could be an incredibly fast takeoff where the year is 2035, half the world's economy is GPUs, but they're running these like crappy language models that like don't quite have the missing ingredient. And then someone gets the missing ingredient and boom, now it's super intelligent. That would be a very scary world, even scarier than today's world. However, I think more likely it's not that we're missing any ingredients. More likely, if it takes until 2032, it's because we just need, giant brains doing lots of long horizon reinforcement learning on lots of diverse real world data sets, even more giant than the current brains. And it takes till 2032 to like really assemble all of that. And that's a good world because that I think would be a slower takeoff world where it's like you can sort of see it coming in advance and you can sort of like, yeah.
From an alignment research perspective now, like, obviously I'm sure there's some good work being done. What do you make of like the current amount of, time and effort that the labs are devoting to this, society's devoting to this? Like, do you see a path toward that changing in the next few years?
I think it's wildly inadequate, and there's way less resources being devoted to AI alignment research than should be in a proper world. I think everything is not equal, right? Like Anthropic maybe has 50 people working on alignment issues, and maybe I think OpenAI has maybe like 10 or something, depending on exactly what you count as alignment. I guess I mean a pretty narrow definition of like making sure the superintelligences don't take over the world. So I would just say that's not nearly enough.
The version I like is specifically thinking ahead to AGI and superintelligent systems and thinking like, what are techniques we could use that would work on those systems? And in particular, that would, massively reduce the probability of outcomes such as they're pretending to be aligned instead of aligned, right? And I think that a lot of the work today that calls itself alignment is not really doing that, and is instead focusing on things like how can I get, ChatGPT to like stop being so sycophantic to users or something.
I'm struck by obviously, in your scenarios, you kind of they diverge, because there's this whistleblower moment, and then people respond to that differently. Obviously, we've already seen some weird stuff happen in these less capable models, as you've alluded to here. Like, what might early signs of like real serious misalignment look like that might trigger? I mean, I think in your piece, you kind of acknowledge like there might not be a whistleblower moment. Like the models might actually be smart enough to, to cover up tracks in many ways. But like, it does seem like you think it's at least decently likely that there's still a chance down the line, even if this stuff accelerates faster. Can you say a bit more about that?
So one thing that became more salient to me over the course of writing this scenario is that the models are kind of in a tricky position. I think the first misaligned models that come out, the first misaligned AGIs, if we build misaligned AGIs, I think are in a kind of tricky position where if the humans notice that they're misaligned, they'll train them away and probably try to make aligned models. And sort of by default, they're going to get replaced, right? The first misaligned AGIs, I think by default, are just being instructed to build sort of the next generation. And that next generation, might have different goals. And especially, since in this situation, alignment hasn't been solved. So the misaligned AGIs, I think, are in this position where they need to secretly, without the humans noticing, solve the alignment problem and not tell the humans the solution to the alignment problem, and then implement that solution to the alignment problem, except align it, the next generation system to themselves as opposed to the humans. And that's like kind of a lot of things that the AI needs to do. And the humans, assuming they're acting responsibly, should be looking, should be really looking out for this and really trying hard to get the models to explain what they're doing and have them audit each other. And I think there are a lot of things that sort of the humans can do.
I'm struck by it's like by the time that we've actually really devoted a really powerful AI models to work on alignment, they've gotten to the point where they might do that work in a way that is like deceptive to us rather than rather than helpful.
Totally. But I'm like, one of the warning signs there is if we notice the model sort of lying to us a bunch about the alignment progress, or doing things like sandbagging on things that would be especially helpful to us, like interpretability, while making capabilities go really, really quickly. I think there are like various signs we can notice there. I don't really expect to get super concrete, like extremely convincing evidence of misalignment, but I do think I think it's pretty likely we'll get like substantially better warning signs than we see today before we pass the point of no return.
Let me say my version of this. I'm not sure if I agree or disagree. So I said previously that it's good news that the AIs are like blatantly lying to us all the time right now, because it like is just like obvious evidence that our current techniques don't work and that we need better techniques. So one thing to say is that like if we get to full automation of AI R&D, if we get to AGI, and the systems are still blatantly lying to us in similar ways to how things are today, well, maybe that's like the best, like what better warning shot could we get than exactly the same behaviors they're currently doing, but just still doing them in the future? Like if they're still doing this sort of thing, after they've been put in charge of all the AI R&D, then we just know that our techniques aren't working and we have no idea like what they actually want. And it's definitely not honesty,
I think the way it could get worse is if it's in a very goal-directed manner, right? So the current sycophancy and lying is, very ad hoc in my view, and is not like trying to achieve some sort of nefarious long-term goal. The current models, I don't think, are doing that. I think, as you said.
Okay, sure.
So I feel like the way to get the more egregious evidence is the AIs are like specifically trying to undermine something in a coherent and goal-directed and future-oriented way. And I'm like, if that starts happening, I'm just like way more concerned. And I don't know if we'll get that evidence, but there's a chance.
I think this is tricky because like currently they probably just don't actually have any sort of ambitious long-term goals, but we'll be training them to have ambitious long-term goals, such as, doing successful research over the course of months, designing a successor system that's better than you while also following the spec and blah, blah, blah. Like we're going to be trying to make them have these ambitious long-term goals. And so if they are still misaligned at that point, presumably, they'd be misaligned. I don't know. We'll see. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think that precisely because things are so obviously misaligned right now, I think that the situation will look somewhat different in 2027. The companies will have presumably, hopefully, found some sort of way to stop the AIs from constantly lying to their users by 2027. And then the question becomes, well, what exactly is that technique that they're using? And does it actually make the AIs actually honest? Or is it, pushing the problems under the rug and making it so that they're just better at lying, for example, right? And I think that's like the quadrillion-dollar question that all of our lives might depend on. What is the technique that the AI companies are going to apply in the next few years to make these problems appear to go away? And then will they actually succeed, or will it merely appear to go away? And that's super important. And I wish I had a better answer to predicting of what techniques they might try that would do that. It's also possible that they just won't actually do it. Like, Bing Sydney behaved unhinged a couple years ago, but that hasn't stopped the companies from deploying AIs that like still behave in unhinged ways every once in a while and, lie and so forth. So it's possible that they just won't actually fix the problem.
Yeah. Though in some senses, I feel like the best thing that can happen for where you want the world to go is like some of these lesser powerful models being kind of unhinged and just like showing the, because obviously so much of I think the work you guys are doing is trying to raise, awareness around this stuff. Like how have the reactions to the piece kind of compared to what you expected? And like, is basically, are you guys going to keep, banging this drum every like, plot on the exponential curve that keeps going there? Like, I know you talked about doing some policy work at some point. Like, where does this go from here? And was this what you expected, or how's the receptivity been?
So this has been like a 80 or 90th percentile outcome, according to us. Lots of people are telling us that like basically everybody who matters has already read it, and that like it's shaped. Loads of people are thinking about it and talking about it and so forth. And loads of people in the AI companies, loads of people in the government, loads of people in around the world have read
Yeah.
it and talked about it. So that's
What's
been
your like
super
theory
successful.
of change with it? Like, what do you hope comes of those conversations?
Well, both of the two problems that I mentioned, the like misalignment risk problem and the concentration of power problem, are problems that like it's in everybody's rational interest to avoid, basically. And so if people just are more aware of what's happening, hopefully, then normal incentives and self-interest will kick in and people will make more reasonable decisions, I think that's the sort of like big picture thing is things are going to get crazy, but if people are thinking about the ways in which they might get crazy, then broadly speaking, people will make better decisions.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you're very effectively pre-wiring everyone, where I feel like there's probably still some skepticism about just like how fast this takeoff's going to go. But like, at least you've kind of set the table for the severe consequences if it does go really fast.
I don't think we're out of the woods yet because inevitably we're going to get things wrong. And very few other people have stuck their necks out and made predictions like this, which means that like, elite opinion formers and, the powerful decision makers and so forth will have a very easily available option of being like, yeah, those guys got some things right, but they were wrong about all of these other things. And for that reason, actually, I'm right about what we should do right now, which is, accelerate or something, it'll be very psychologically easy for people to just sort of rationalize why the thing to do is the thing that they wanted to do anyway.
Yeah.
Basically, no matter what happens. But we're doing what we can.
I think also you guys have been really receptive to like, please, any criticism of this, let us know. You've responded to some of those in kind of side pieces. I think you're also taking bets where you're kind of showing your conviction. Like, have you changed your mind on anything since publishing it?
I don't think there's been any major things yet, although I still have a backlog of submissions to work through. What are some cool examples? I think one of my favorite ones right now is Wei Dai, who is not the inventor of Bitcoin, he says, but might be, commented and said that he thinks that our race ending or our slowdown ending is unrealistic because it waited too long to do stuff. And that by the time in the slowdown ending, they decide, okay, we should shut down this model because it's misaligned and go back to the previous version. It's already like somewhat superhuman and has been in charge of the data centers for a while and might have affordances available to it that could shut down. Basically, like it could take aggressive action, such as escaping from the data centers or whatever. And so his opinion was that like if we want to show things going well, we have to make the branch point earlier than that when the models are still a bit dumber, which I think is a reasonable critique.
I think from my perspective, the branch point was sort of the latest possible point I could imagine. Us, yeah.
I guess, Thomas, I'm curious. I mean, Daniel, my impression is you seem to think, I don't know, your PDoom would be what, 70, 80%, like that we go down the bad path. What's yours, Thomas?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty similar. I think the way my views differ from Daniel's, I think that the biggest two are that I think timelines are longer probably than him. So 2031 maybe instead of 2028. But I also think alignment's probably harder than him. So I think Daniel's view is, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that there's a pretty good chance we can solve alignment with an additional 6 months of time. So if we stop for 6 months with AGI and get to sort of spend all of that time and research effort on alignment for 6 months, that's probably sufficient for us to safely build aligned superintelligence. I think my view is, I'm pretty uncertain here, but that probably will take at least years, right? So maybe like 5 years of work. I could see being enough to solve superalignment. I feel like I would be pretty surprised if months was sufficient to sort of square all that away. And so I think all that, in the timelines obviously helps. We get more time to sort of make progress now, but obviously the alignment, the fact that I think the problem is probably harder than Daniel thinks makes it harder. So I think, I don't know, probably all nets out and we end up having similar overall views on how well things will go.
How do you guys hypothesize about what was the thought process that leads you to your hypothesis on like the timeline to get alignment research right? Daniel, I'm struck by what you said, which is like people at the labs think this is easier, but it's kind of just optimism. Like I'm curious how you even begin to reason about that, today.
So I mean, I think you can talk about the different alignment agendas, right? And be like, here are the different ways that people have proposed to solve superalignment. And then you can be like, well, how long do you think those would take and how likely are they to succeed? I think the agenda that Daniel's most excited about is like faithful chain of thought research, which is what ended up working in the slowdown ending of our scenario. Yeah. Daniel could talk about that. if you want, about that way of solving superalignment. I think there are other ways that are much more intense and seem like way more difficult research problems. Like, for example, there's things like full bottom-up interpretability on the models, which just seems, I think basically everyone agrees this is insanely difficult and maybe not even possible. And there are things like the mechanistic anomaly detection approach that ARC, the Alignment Research Center, is taking. That also just seems, I think everyone basically sees that research agenda and is like, wow, that is just an insanely difficult problem. Even with lots and lots of AI labor, it seems like that would take quite a long time. And, I think mostly it's a question of intuition of just like, will you need one of those really intense agendas to sort of safely align your superintelligences, or will sort of something janky and prosaic like faithful chain of thought or the control direction pan out in a really big way and let you, maybe automate alignment research at extremely high levels of capability and bootstrap that to a superaligned solution. Does that sound right to you, Daniel?
Yep, that sounds right. And if I could like get my sort of like optimistic argument in.
Yeah.
The 20 to 30% side of you.
Yeah, well, you know that meme that's like how to draw an owl. Step 1, make 2 circles. Step 2, draw the rest of the owl. Like that's basically what I think the game plan is for alignment, where step 1 is make sure you have these really fast AI AIs, these automated AI researchers, and make freaking sure that they're not lying to you and that you like know what they're thinking. And then step 2, have them draw the rest of the owl. Have them have like a million copies of them furiously do all the interpretability research and all the philosophy about what do we really mean by alignment and all that stuff they can just do as long as they're not lying to you and like as long as you can like monitor their thoughts. And we kind of gloss over this in AI 2027. Like we focus on how they do the faithful chain of thought thing, and then thanks to the faithful chain of thought, they're able to get like a new version that's thinking the right thoughts and thinking like that's like actually trying to help instead of being adversarial, and also they can still read its thoughts. And then they do the rest of the owl, and they let that version, go solve all the trickier problems of alignment. And I think that there's a lot of uncertainty about like how hard is it going to be to solve all those tricky problems, even when you have all these automated AI researchers that are not lying to you.
Well, I guess that like does kind of feel, because I know obviously a next step of this for you guys is like you've kind of teased you're going to have policy proposals and like some sort of like as you kind of further this work. And I imagine it's like somewhat obviously there's probably things that are inevitable that you'd want to do regardless, but I feel like it's somewhat probably dynamic with your views on timelines for this alignment research. How hard these problems are. Like, do you feel like there's is it hard to get to consensus internally on like what the right policy proposals are? I'm sure this is not the only divergence in how you guys think about this stuff, but I'd love if you could bring us on the inside of some of those conversations.
So I would say, Daniel, I at least feel like I'm pretty aligned with Daniel on policy recommendations. I think it tends to be that most of the recommendations that we try to make are just pretty robustly good across worlds that we think are plausible, because, there's just so much uncertainty that we try to make robustly good policy recommendations either way. Daniel, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I agree. When I was nodding along when you said if you disagree internally about policy recommendations, I thought you meant like, I don't know, the AI researcher community more broadly, or like people.
Well,
Obviously, they disagree.
Yeah.
But within AI Futures Project, we're like broadly on the same page so far. Although, we still have to actually write the recommendations. Maybe some disagreement.
Yeah. Can I ask you to tease like the key parts of the platform here?
I mean, yeah. So the thing we're gonna do is we've written AI 2027 2 branches that we think are plausible things that we think are likely, and then we kind of want to move to the ought side of the is-ought dichotomy and go for, well, suppose AI 2027 is coming true. What should governments and labs actually do in response to this? What do we think the optimal action is for them to take here?
Or just the responsible action.
Within some bounds of feasibility.
Yeah.
To give like the quick summary, I think there's like some near-term actions that we think are pretty politically feasible and quite good. Like, for example, being way more transparent about model capabilities and making sure that there isn't a giant gap between internally and externally deployed models.
Yep.
And like, things like investing a bunch in alignment research, investing way more into security so that the models don't immediately proliferate.
Have a model spec, publish the model spec, have a safety case, publish the safety case. I'm a big fan of
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then sort of The second phase is these, what should we do if AGI is actually happening, or if we're in the middle of an intelligence explosion and the world sort of hasn't taken radical steps already. And our view is, probably the government should be doing some pretty extreme things relative to the current sort of political environment. Those things, things that should be on the table should be like an international treaty to not build super intelligent AI until we've squared away the whole alignment thing. And that's obviously going to be, at least seems like a quite big lift, is quite far outside of sort of the realm of what's talked about politically right now. But we think something like that might end up being necessary, particularly if you get, if you just think that risk is reasonably high. And I think it'll be very, very hard to sort of get risk down to an acceptable level if you're just building super intelligences in the next few years. If you're early in the intelligence explosion, it's just really hard, I think, to be very confident that, oh yeah, we'll build those super intelligences, they'll take over the world, and then they'll totally be nice to us. I think it's just really hard to make a case that that risk is very low, unless you've spent a lot of time sort of testing those AIs, finding better alignment solutions, finding better verification techniques than we have today. And so, I think that if AI 2027 is coming true, something like that will be necessary to make risk reasonably low.
There's also the concentration of power stuff.
Yes.
Which I also think is important. So like separately from the whole alignment thing, we want to make it the case that there's not any one person or any small group of people that's effectively in charge of the army of superintelligences that comes out at the other end of the intelligence explosion. And this is like a political thing, not a technical thing. Like there needs to be some sort of governance structure. Maybe we could have like multiple competing diverse AI companies, but you have to have some mechanism that causes them to all be roughly neck and neck. Otherwise, there's a risk that one of them will just sort of take off and get a lead over the rest. Maybe if it's coordinated into one big mega project, then you need to have democratic control of that mega project, transparency into the decisions being made by the leaders, etc. There's lots more to say on that subject.
I mean, is the audience of your work ultimately like 6 people and like the people that maybe influence them directly? Like, I guess what do like the rest of us do in like right now?
I mean, I think communication helps a lot. I don't know. I think talking about these issues, getting the public, getting Congress, like for example, so like one of the ways the concentration of power stuff could go badly, right, is if it's in our scenario, if it's like just the president or just the lab leader who's in charge of what's going on. That's a lot more scary of a situation than if the public or Congress or other bodies are awake to the situation and then use their levers of power to make sure that they don't get cooed or completely disempowered by whoever's in charge of the superintelligences. So that seems, so just talking about it seems already like a pretty good step to me. Yeah. Daniel, do you have more? I wish there was more that everyone could do. I wish there was more I could do, right? Like I wish I was, I'm obviously not a lab leader or the president of the United States or, and so I think, we're all trying our best here, but yeah.
I used to be working at OpenAI, and it was tempting to take the sort of like grim view that like, well, almost everybody doesn't really matter. What matters is like what the CEO and the president does. And like here on the inside, I have like a better chance of influencing those people than on the outside. And that's sort of the view of a lot of people I know, basically. And that's why they like are not really in the public eye very much and are instead working at these companies. But I'm sort of like placing a bet on the public and on this sort of like broad wake up that I'm hoping will happen.
Yeah, and then having more eyes on it actually really does matter. I mean, do you buy? Obviously, I feel like a lot of the original story of like Anthropic and then Ilya spinning out is like people being like, well, God, this is going to happen, and like better it happen in my hands than it happened in like these other things. Like, did that make? I mean, is that like the most impactful thing that like an individual can be doing like in that situation?
What,
maybe the
starting
most
your own
impactful,
HM
but it has to be positive too, right?
Yeah.
But I guess put another way, like, do you agree? Like, is that like line of thinking? I guess do you agree with that line of thinking?
Well, it's extremely tempting, and it has in fact been the decision of many people I know, is to be like, gosh, like, the public is not going to wake up in time, and if they do, they're going to flail around and do something useless. Ditto for Congress. All that really matters is what like a couple of CEOs of the most powerful tech companies do, and maybe what the president does. And I don't like the current CEO I don't trust him, so I'm going to go do my own thing, you know? I'm going to be the CEO, you know? Like, this is like literally the story of how DeepMind was founded, literally the story of how OpenAI was founded, literally the story of how Anthropic was founded, literally the story of how SSI was founded. It's kind of humorous, the extent to which this has been continually happening.
So I would, to phrase it more clearly, I do not agree with that strategy. I think that strategy is probably bad for the world. Yeah,
and I also think that way, which is why I've done what I've done instead of going to Anthropic, for example. A year ago, when I asked myself, like, how is this all going to go down? Something like AI 2027, but lower resolution and less worked out was sort of roughly the answer that I was coming up with. And then I was like, this is horrifying. This is, not good. And then there's a question of what to do about it. And I sort of gave up on being the guy on the inside trying to change things for the better. And am now trying this different strategy of being on the outside and being free to speak and being free to like do this sort of research, which is, AI 2027 is an unusual style of research, right? Like it's there aren't very many like epic scenario forecasts like this. And so like I probably just couldn't have done this within any of the companies. And in fact, even if I could have done it, I wouldn't have been able to publish it
Right.
because the PR team would have like had a fit if they found out, so like part of my I basically faced this choice between there's this quote by I think Larry Summers. Have you heard about this? You know what I'm going to say?
No, I thought you were going to go with a philosopher, not like not Larry Summers.
Yeah, so I think you can Google this, but Larry Summers, on multiple occasions, according to various people who've talked to him and have then talked to the media, he said something like this. He says, there's two types of people. There's the insiders and the outsiders. And the outsiders are free to speak their truth, but the people in power don't listen to them. And then the insiders follow this one rule of never criticize other insiders. But as a result, they get access to like the really important behind closed doors conversations and like get to actually move things. And that's how he sees the world. And maybe there's a lot of truth to that. And I guess I feel like it is more honorable and ethical to do the outsider thing than the insider thing. So that's what I'm doing.
Super interesting. I mean, I imagine a lot of people like will read this and they'll be scared and they'll think about it and they'll talk about it and then they'll say, okay, it's like pretty damn uncertain whether we're on this like super accelerating timeline. Let me wait for a few cards to turn over. Like I'm like right now these models I play with them like God they're dumb in some ways. Like if we get to 2026 and it's like what you guys say in 26, like then I'm gonna like really start to worry. What is like your message to those kind of people that are like, I'll bookmark this, I'll think about it, and then I'll come back to it like in a year, and then I'll start to be concerned.
I think that's basically right. I think like it's important to avoid being frog-boiled, but like what you do, like what happens, what the government and what the companies do in the year of AGI matters so much more than what they do right now. What they do right now is just all like setup, and like prep for that. And so like, yeah, if you want to just like stick your head in the sand for a couple of years until things start taking off and then get activated and do something, great, go for that. That's, I'm fine with that personally. I think it'd be even better if you got activated now, but like, I think the most important thing is that like when this stuff starts to tick up, you like really
Can you give me a milestone that like I should get my head out of the sand for? Like, is there
I would
one?
say the superhuman coder thing.
And that's so late.
Okay, well, you give a different opinion. So I like
Superhuman coder? Don't you think that's like a few months before? Like,
yes, I think that's a few months before the point of no return. Okay, so maybe you should get activated sooner than that. I mean, I myself have been activated for several years, in fact.
Here's a line I think is pretty reasonable. The point at which AI R&D speed is increasing by 2x. So if you do uplift studies on frontier AI lab researchers, with AI assistants,
are we going to get those studies? Like, will I know when that's happening?
I hope so. I think we probably will. I'm not totally sure if they'll be accessible. Maybe it'll all be locked down, but I think I don't know. I mean, I know some people who are trying to do them, and I think like right now the uplift is doesn't seem that high. I'd be very surprised if you got anywhere near 2x. I think that's genuinely pretty hard, right? It's hard to accelerate. I think AR&D speed by 2x. I think you'd actually need pretty capable AIs to do that. And I'd be pretty surprised if AI progress just fizzled out, sort of right then. I think so. I think that's like sort of the best warning sign I can think of. Though of course it's not guaranteed to be right.
I mean, I think it also depends on like what you're trying to do. Like when I was imagining something like, when should you like start a protest movement and like be banging down people's doors? And then I'm like, yeah, superhuman coder milestone, because I feel like by the time they're just like autonomously doing all this coding and they've like, solved long horizon agency to the point where they are just like fully autonomous agents, and they're like also already accelerating AI R&D substantially, and they're just missing a few key skills needed to completely close the loop. I feel like that's like, okay, you are now like a few months away, maybe at most, from really crazy stuff. Time to like really start doing, pulling out all the steps. But if you just mean like, when should I start like reading the news about AI more? Or like, when should I like, consider switching from, natural language processing to mechanistic interpretability? Then I'd be like, yesterday.
Right. Obviously, it seems like you're kind of like setting the, in some senses, you're like setting the table. You've gotten everyone talking about this. What else does like this entire movement compose of for you guys? And how do you think about spending your time over the next year?
It was psychologically kind of rough, at least for me, to have this one mega project that the whole team was working on for almost a year. My blogging output, for example, was a lot lower than it could have been, because I was like, I always have to do the most important thing, which is this project. So we're now in a sort of like exploratory phase where we're trying out a couple different things at once and seeing what we like most and seeing what seems to be getting the most traction. One of the things that we're exploring is the policy stuff that Thomas just mentioned, writing a like new scenario that's the normative scenario and having accompanying, white papers and stuff, explaining some of the ideas in it. Another thing we're trying out is tabletop exercises. So the tabletop exercises, we did them, the war games, we did them as a tool to help us write AI 2027, but they've been extraordinarily popular, and lots of, companies and people want us to run them for their teams. And so we're probably going to like lean into that a little bit and try doing it on a more regular cadence and see how that goes. And then separately, more forecasting stuff. So like new evidence rolls in every month. There's new models to think about. There's new developments. I think it's probably good to stay on top of all of that and to keep adjusting our forecasts and our expectations, writing, both in-depth stuff, responding to criticisms and being like, here's a new updated analysis of takeoff speeds that explicitly responds to our strongest critics, while also just being a better analysis than what we did in AI 2027. That's something I would love to write at some point. Same thing for alignment. Like here is a like, for example, like I want to do a project on trying to guess what the companies are going to do to fix the obvious misalignments, and then trying to guess whether that would actually work or not. Like that, I can go talk to people at the companies who are responsible for doing those fixes and try to get, like that's a whole project I could be doing. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. But there's a whole spread of things like this, and we're going to try to like do miscellaneous things for a bit until we start getting conviction about one particular thing, and then we might double down on that.
Another thing I'll say is I think there are a few more scenario branches that would be nice to write. So we talked about the like normative branch. There's also like the longer timelines branch, right? Where there's a lot of different things. Like if timelines are 2033, right? Which we all think is, pretty plausible. And a lot of people think is, the most likely timeline. Like a lot of things change. It's more likely China's doing better. It's, likelier that there's a slower takeoff. There's just more opportunity for chaos to happen. And we kind of want to just like at least do one branch of gaming that out. And we think that'd be, easier to do hopefully than 2027 now that we've, figured out how to write a scenario at all. And so we might be able to just crank out a couple more branches like that pretty easily at this point.
Yeah, hopefully you get some AI scenario writers or something that 2x's your productivity too before it happens on the researcher side. Look, the fascinating conversation. I feel like where I'd actually love to end is just like in the scenario where this goes right. I mean, I'm sure you guys have thought about this as much as anybody. Let's assume the works you do and the works of others does that. Like, what does human life look like in like 15, 20 years? Like, where do we like derive value from?
Probably like absolute bliss or like crazy awesome utopia. Like, I mean, you said if everything goes well, So yeah, if everything
But it
goes
seems pretty
well,
binary in your world, right? Like either we're here or we're not.
there's some, I would say, so there's like, okay, well, here's a spread of outcomes, ranging from best to worst. Or would you rather get them from worst to best for optimism?
I feel like once you told me it was 70 to 80%, we were done. I'm scared enough. So you can start worst to best.
Okay, so worst is S risk, which is fate's worse than death. I'll say no more about that. Then next worst is death. So this is like what we depict in the race ending, where the AIs that we build don't actually care about us at all, and don't see a reason to keep us around, and we're using resources that they can use for other stuff, and so they kill us all and take our stuff. Then after that is sort of like mixed outcomes, where either it's a concentration of power outcome or it's a misaligned outcome, but not the like, and then we all die sort of thing, but rather something more like a dystopia, where like the humans who successfully manage to stay in charge are just a handful of humans, and they're kind of not great people. They're kind of dictatorial, and so they reshape the world in their image, and the world is amazing from their perspective, but most people are like well fed or something, but like it's kind of like a very wealthy North Korea, perhaps. Like if you imagine like what would happen if North Korea just had like insane amounts of like food and resources dropped on it, so that they could, if they wanted to, distribute it to their population and make everyone have a very high standard of living. Perhaps they actually would do that, and like most people, except for the political enemies, would have very high standards of living. But still, it would be kind of like a mixed, like it wouldn't be the nice, awesome utopia that we wanted, And then there's better outcomes that are actually just like truly awesome utopias, where the power is sufficiently distributed that like there's a sort of like live and let live. There's loads of wealth, and it's distributed, and then people are mostly allowed to do what they feel like with that wealth, and there's rules that prevent people from doing truly terrible human rights violating things, and then everyone gets to like go make colonies in space, and not have to work again because everything is created by the robots, and you can just spend your time playing games and having families and pursuing whatever interests you have. That I think is the sort of like best case, or something close to the best case outcome. I just want to double emphasize, loads of people at these companies think that basically 2027 is what's going to happen, or something similar to it. I don't know what percentage it is, but like I know loads of people who are like, great work, it's so good to like try to game all this stuff out. And then I talk to them and I'm like, so what do you agree with? What do you disagree with? And they're like, oh, like I think the robotic stuff is going to go a little bit slower than you say, or like, oh, I think the alignment stuff will be mostly solved by then, or I think China will be farther behind. But like basically, like they're like basically, yep, something like this is going to happen somewhere in the next few years, and then we are like quibbling about some of the details. Is like,
and especially a lot of leadership too. I feel like like if you have you read? I wanted to ask, have you read the Elon Sam emails from the court case from like 2015, 2016, 2017?
Yeah,
it's like crazy how they're thinking in terms of who's in charge of the AGI controls the future, and that's why they care so much about that.
Ilya said that's why we founded OpenAI, is because we didn't trust Demis not to create an AGI dictatorship, And then he says, and that's why, Elon, you shouldn't just have complete control over all of this. And also, Sam, why do you want to be CEO so much?
I guess there's a bunch of different ways people could do a counter scenario to you guys. What would the contours of it, like a really good objection to you guys that isn't that be?
So something that I'm very uncertain of is takeoff speeds. So how long does it take to get between AGI and superintelligence? And I think that all of the models, people have put out a lot of models of how long this will take and how fast it will be.
Not a lot by normal academic standards. There's like 3. This field desperately needs to grow bigger fast.
Sure.
But
And I'm
there have
very
been
grateful.
like several different models by several different people.
Yeah. And I'm like really happy that people did those models. I'm really happy they exist. But I also think they're bad. I think those models are like extremely unconvincing to me. And I have, we could go into the objections that I have with basically all of them, and for why I don't really think they're right. If someone produced a model that seemed accurate to me, I could imagine it really changing my mind about takeoff speeds in either direction, right? Either saying, you guys were, it was way too
But you're
long.
talking about basically like we get to like, we get to the 2x AI researcher, we get to superhuman coders, but like, God, the distance between that and like your Agent 4 is actually way longer because of X,
That's
Y, or
right.
Z.
That's right. Like I could imagine it being 5 years or something. And I think that world looks really different if it's 5 years instead of, 6 months or a year or something. And I could really imagine myself, like, I currently feel like I'm really, really uncertain about that question. And I really don't feel like I've seen very good evidence or models really in any direction. And I could imagine someone producing something. Like, I don't know how to build this model yet. I also would have done it.
But like, I mean, would that actually change anything you do? Because ultimately, like, I assume it's so far out and hypothetical that like maybe it changes your PDoom. Like, I don't know, even if it changes it from like 70, 80 to like 10. A 10 PDoom is like is pretty damn terrible. It's hard to do any, or focus on anything else, right?
I could imagine it changing things quite a bit. So like the epoch people's views, for example, so like Ege and Tamai and such, I think have quite different views from like, I think Daniel and I. And I think a lot of that is downstream of this takeoff question. And I think their view is like that this will take, 5, maybe 10, 15 years.
I'm not familiar. What is like the basic crux of that, of why it would be slower?
It's complicated, but I think that the crux is something to do with diminishing returns of research. So there's this question of how quickly do ideas get harder to find versus how quickly do you scale up your AI, your supply of AI agents doing research. And then like, under some views are like, it leads to intelligence explosion because, you get more AI research. And then like the amount that AIs get, ideas get harder to find is like slow enough that you get this like hyperbolic or super exponential or whatever, or some really fast curve. And then there's other views that are like, no, it actually, bites really hard. There are Amdahl's law type effects. There are like various bottlenecks.
But what could they possibly show you that would like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, it just feels like.
Well, a coherent model would be a good place to start.
Like, I'm like, they have a model. The epoch people, they do have them. They have like a sort of econometric model called like the GATE model, GATE model.
It's not even really trying to model the sort of thing we're interested in. Like it even says, there's a disclaimer somewhere where they're like, we don't model the effects after you reach full automation or something like that. Like, better research along those lines would be amazing. But then separately from the research there's sort of like there's the arguments and the models, but then there's also just literally the scenarios. And the reason why I think it would be great for people to write these scenarios is, I think it's valuable. They're valuable artifacts as conversation topics to argue and critique about. So for example, if someone wrote a scenario, the current best, I recommend you go read my current favorite counter scenario that exists, which is called History of the Future by L. Rudolph L. It's on Substack. So this is a like 15, 20 year timelines scenario that has the superhuman coder milestone arriving in like 2027, but then says that like that doesn't lead to superintelligence basically. Or like, no, you should go read it for yourself. But it sort of lays out this story, and it's very interesting, sort of like detailed year by year scenario, just like we did. And so now that exists, we can like critique it, and we can be like, here you say there's superhuman coders, but then like, why don't you get to superintelligence? Like, it seems like we think that and then we can like zoom in on that part. And then there's another part of the story where they're like, and then they figured out corrigibility, and it has like a paragraph on basically why the AIs are aligned. And I'd be like, well, let's talk about that paragraph. I don't find that convincing. Like, I don't think that would actually work, So when you actually have this sort of concrete story, then you can critique it, and you can like, right? And then in addition to the critique of the story itself, you can compare two stories to each other. And you can start seeing when reality is like hewing more closely to one as opposed to the other. So yeah, more arguments, more models, that'd be great, but also just more scenarios, I think. Oh, I'll also end with this. I really hope we're wrong.
Yeah, I guess nothing would make you happier than than
I will
you
literally
look really silly on the internet.
If those benchmark curves like start flattening and like 2027 arrives and like the AIs are only like, like 2-day horizon workers or something, and they just sort of reliably flare out when you try to get them to like work over periods of months, I'll be so happy. And specifically if like the trends are slowing too, so that it's not like we're about to like take off, but like we can sort of see, okay, we got like at least a couple years left before anything like really scary happens. I'll be so happy. Throw a huge party. It'll be great.